I wanted to create a short video about the era 1914 to 1945 and why I've chosen to write historical novels about the era. They say that you should write what you know. And although I wasn't alive from 1914 to 1945, I like to say that I grew up in the era's shadows. The stories that I was told as a child from my parents, from my grandparents, they had a tremendous impact on my childhood and on how I viewed the world. In fact, I was so enthralled by the stories that were told to me as a child that from a very young age, I decided to do lots and lots of research on the era, reading anything that I could get my hands on in terms of history books and oral histories. So I like to say I've got 45 years of scholarship under my belt on the era, and I'm not done yet. I continue to just voraciously read these stories and read these histories. The other thing that they say about writing is that the stakes should be high, that ordinary day-to-day life is often boring, and that writing novels, storytelling, is like real life, only better because the stakes are higher. And although writing about the era 1914 to 1945 doesn't ensure or guarantee that the characters created will have high stakes, it certainly creates a backdrop for the highest stakes in human history. This is an era of war, of social dislocation, migration, economic hardship. And finally, this is the era of literature that I'm most interested in. This is the era of great literature. I like to say that nowadays we're all just bunting for singles. And the era of literature that I study, the era of literature that I'm most interested in reading, is the modernist era. So the modern era, I would argue, begins in 1914. It begins with the outset of World War I. And World War I not only means destruction of humanity, it destroys a lot of myths. One of the prevalent myths prior to the war was that there was this unending stream of technological progress, and that technology was going to save mankind. And if we only had enough technological innovations, we would end hunger, disease, war. World War I instantaneously and forever destroys that myth. Suddenly we see the dark side of technology: chemical warfare, the gas attacks, the bombing of civilians, genocide. Prior to World War I would argue we were in a culture of regionalism. And the war ends regionalism and brings us into the new modern era of globalism. And globalism is often connected with the term total war. And what that means is not only are the combatants with the weapons in their hands part of the war machine, but everyone on the planet, to greater or lesser extents, contributes to war. Civilians working in factories, in munitions factories, are now fair game, and we're perfectly within our rights as combatants to bomb them because they make the weapons of war. And if you want to end the war, you have to destroy civilian populations that are making the bombs to fight you and kill your populations. It's an era of dislocation and alienation. The individual feels powerless. Mainly they feel powerless against the state. They're being forced into combat. They're being forced into factory work, making bombs. They're subject to the state, which is waging war against them. It's also an era of mass migration. And we can go on and on about these, but I'll mention the two biggest migrations. The Great Migration of African Americans from the rural South to the urban South, and more prevalently from the rural South through the urban South to the urban North. And the tail end of the European migration to the United States. So the Great War actually interrupted this migratory trend from Europe to the United States that was going on for decades prior to the onset of war in 1914. And obviously when 1914 comes, that temporarily puts an end to European migration and becomes an engine for the Great Migration of African Americans from the rural South to the North. When the war ends, European migration resumes. It resumes from 1918, when the war ends, until the 1924 Immigration Act, which curtails immigration from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. As I said before, this is a fertile era in the arts. It's fertile ground for modernism, that's indisputable. But I'm actually going to argue that it's fertile ground for magical realism. So modernism, this idea that the individual feels dislocated from culture, from their community, they feel alienation, that is reflected in the modernist structure, in the disjointed modernist structure in literature. I'm also going to argue that very soon after the outbreak of World War I, we have magical realism. We have realistic characters struggling with magical elements. Now, I know that magical realism is traditionally associated with the second half of the 20th century, but I think I've got a strong argument that says it begins with 1914 and the modernist era. When World War I ends, there's lots of optimism, lots of hope, but in fact, the armistice resolves nothing. All of the events that mark the continuation of the era from war's end in 1918 throughout the end of the era in 1945 are more of the same and only worse. 1918 to 1919 is the greatest epidemic in modern history, the Spanish flu epidemic. It infects 1/3 of the global population and kills at least 20 million. Economic weakness marks much of the era, but especially the era beginning 1929 with the economic collapse and the stock market crash in the United States throughout 1939. So you could argue there's economic weakness in Germany, there's hyperinflation in Germany that precedes the era of 1929, but certainly in 1929, this economic weakness becomes a global event, a global collapse. And that global economic collapse leads to social unrest, social dislocation. In the wake of this economic collapse, one of the first things to rise out of the economic collapse, one of the first consequences, is a rise of militaristic totalitarian dictatorships. In the USSR under Stalin, and 4 years later, in 1933, in Germany under Hitler. The Great Depression itself only ends with the onset of the Second War in 1939, World War II, which runs from 1939 until the end of the era, 1945. The Second War is a revisitation of all the horrors of World War I, except now all of those horrors are magnified. Total war is revisited, but now total war expands, and we are dealing with a much, much larger percentage of the global population involved in the activity of war. In World War I, we had the Turkish genocide perpetrated against the Armenians. That type of an event is repeated in World War II, only magnified on a much greater scale by the Nazis against the minority populations of Europe. We had bombing of civilian populations in World War I, and this bombing of civilian populations is magnified as well. In the early years of the war, the bombing of Britain. As the war shifts and Germany starts losing, the bombing of German cities, Dresden, and the war itself ends with the bombing of civilian populations, which is unprecedented in human history due to the technological innovation, the atomic bomb. First over Hiroshima and then over Nagasaki. The other reason why I'm so interested in this era is the literature that comes out of this era. As I said before, most people argue that magical realism is a second half of the 20th century phenomena. But if you think about it, Kafka's Metamorphosis, which comes out in 1915, very soon after the onset of the era, it depicts realistic characters struggling with magical elements. So Gregor Samsa awakens and he's an insect, a beetle. And this is life out of balance. This is a modern era novella in the tradition of magical realism. The most famous novel of the era is Ulysses. It comes out in 1922 and is quickly described as the modernist novel. It has a modernist structure. What does that mean? It's a disjointed modernist structure. It jumps from one voice to another, from one image to another, without clearly delineating these shifts for the reader. Arguably the greatest poem of the 20th century is also a modernist poem. And this is T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. It comes out in 1922, the same year as Ulysses, and is highly influenced by Ulysses. Eliot himself is quoted as saying, "I hold this book, Ulysses, to be the most important expression which the present age has found. It is a book to which we are all indebted and from which none of us can escape." And today, almost 100 years later, we could make the same statement, that we are all indebted to Ulysses and none of us can escape its literary legacy. Why I wrote a novel in the tradition of magical realism. Characters striving to transcend reality's boundaries are psychologically satisfying to the reader. Their struggle with magical elements fosters empathy. By setting these magical elements against a realistic backdrop, our empathy is magnified. Further, the novel's use of historical markers makes such realistic backdrops even more familiar, more accessible. Thanks for joining me, and if you're interested in more presentations like this, you can email me magicalrealismauthor@gmail.com. You can follow me on Facebook @magicalrealismnovels.